did you want to mention that apparently the questionnaire...
Yep. Good morning, everybody. Hello. Right, the warmest welcome to the first lecture in the series on water, clearly a popular topic. Now, one or two or three or four things I'd like to talk about before we start. The first one is that we had a committee meeting on Tuesday, this last Tuesday, to talk about the new series for 2023. And we've got some good ideas. One of the things we did talk about was interest groups. Interest groups are an important part of U3A. I think there's 13 or 14% of us that belong to one or other of the interest groups, and we'd like to see more people given the opportunity. We also talked about possible new interest groups. There are 3 or 4 suggestions. One of them is an e-bike group, a music appreciation group. There is a new book group, not on the BDS system, which is a good system, but an alternative to the BDS system, and then also reintroducing the Thursday film group. Now, those interest groups, we're going to send a board around next Friday, and if you're interested, please put your name down, because we'd like to ascertain the interest that there might be in those groups. The questionnaire, the results of the questionnaire have all been collated and put into a report. That report, a summary and the full report, are on the Rutherford website. So well worth a read. I invite you to read that. The Rutherford Choir. Alison Wakehorn has decided that she'd really like to get that going again. Next Friday at 9:30 there'll be a practice. Now, Alison has also said that she's got, I think it's about 10 keen members at the moment, but you'd like to have some more. So please, and I think men especially, is that right? Men especially, males especially, but anybody who'd like to join that choir, turn up at 9:30 next Friday at the back room. And there's also here, I don't usually make announcements on things other than U3A, but Emma, our the church administrator, has said that there's a quilting exhibition here over the 14th to 20th of October. There'll be a quilt exhibition here, and also a talk by Professor Miriam Fisher on the 18th of October with regard to that quilting work, which is an artwork associated with two people from the Bible. So she asked me just to bring that up. Without more ado, Joan, would you be good enough, please, to introduce our speaker for today?
Good morning. Our speaker today is Professor John Harding. John is a Professor Emeritus in the School of Biological Science at Canterbury University. He has been a freshwater ecologist for over 30 years. He's co-authored 7 technical books and over 150 scientific publications and conducted research in New Zealand, USA, Tonga, Singapore and Nigeria. John spent most of his career as an academic teacher and researcher, firstly as a postdoctoral fellow at Virginia Tech in USA, before moving to the University of Canterbury. John's research has focused on the impact of human activities on the ecology of streams and rivers. In particularly over the last 12 years, he has been involved in the Canterbury Waterway Rehabilitation Experiment and the Living Water with the Department of Conservation and Fonterra Partnership. He has served on numerous government panels and expert advisory groups. He retired last year and is now making YouTubes on freshwater topics. John, I'll give you the floor.
Thanks, John. I think we're at the back of the slide, so thanks very much, Joan, for that introduction, and thank you for coming along today and asking me to give a talk on freshwater, which hopefully we'll do in a minute. Do you want to see me? Well, I think...
Can you sort of talk without the overheads for a wee while?
Well, I could, but there's actually photos I want to show people. So I guess we had a look at it before. It's working fine. Here we go. We're on now. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. So Tourism New Zealand has spent decades advertising New Zealand as a place to visit. And they came up quite a long time ago now with this idea of 100% pure. And this advertising program has been extremely successful. However, as time has gone on, more and more Kiwis, I think, have started to realise that actually maybe... Okay. Can we move to the next slide? This worked 5 minutes ago. Some years ago, I was at a conference and one of my students was giving a talk to quite a large crowd of people, and the lights went out and the power went off. And so we're totally in the dark. And the student was particularly talented because he was able to give his entire presentation in the dark in order. Obviously, he was talking about showing people some things, and he wasn't able to do that. But it was a really impressive piece of work, regardless. I could wing this, but I really would like to show you some of the photos and some of the diagrams I'm going to talk about. So I don't know if I really want to launch into this without you being able to see the presentation. Yeah, so talk amongst yourselves. Imagine the lights have gone out. Is the problem the live streaming or something? Oh. Hi, I'm back. Okay, so I think hopefully we might be able to show you some slides now. So I was talking about 100% pure, and this particular photo appeared a little while ago, which sort of indicated that maybe we weren't 100% pure, so more. So today what I'm going to spend the next little while about is talking to you about how our freshwater systems have become degraded, how water quantity and water quality has become impaired. And I'll finish off by trying to talk about sort of what we might be doing about this. We're lucky enough to live on this blue planet, which is dominated by water. Unfortunately for us, most of it's salt water, and we actually need fresh water. And in fact, of all of the water available on the planet, a relatively small amount of it is fresh water. We ourselves consist primarily of fresh water, and humans absolutely require fresh water for their survival, as do many vertebrate species. And in fact, if we go without fresh water for less than a week, then our body starts to shut down and we have serious problems. Well, we know from historical records that at least 10 major civilizations declined and crashed through a lack of fresh water. They ran out of water in their environments. And so up on the top left-hand side here is the Akkadian dynasty, way back in Mesopotamia. Some of you may recognize the Mayan pyramids in the middle here. At least 2 Chinese dynasties fell because of a lack of fresh water. And the Khmer Empire in Cambodia also ran out of fresh water. We know from relatively recent research that they had massive irrigation systems and they had an enormous population, and all of that crashed. The Anasazi people in Arizona and New Mexico, the cliff-dwelling people, had to move out because of lack of fresh water, and also probably the Nabateans in Jordan over on the bottom right-hand side there. Today, 2022, we're already hearing about major droughts around the world. So this is a photograph from France, which was on the news relatively recently, where they've actually stated that they have a drought catastrophe. They've run out of water. The same sort of thing is happening in China at the present moment. Significant populations of Chinese people no longer have water. There's liable to be food shortages and a whole lot of issues. So again, this dependence on water and the supply of water in this case is really important. One of the things that sort of surprised me to a certain extent as a scientist is that Hollywood have even cottoned on to the fact of the importance of water. So I don't know how many of you ever saw this movie, Quantum of Solace, James Bond, 007, and in all of the James Bond movies, the bad guy is always controlling nuclear weapons or trying to get into space or do something like this. For the first time ever, a James Bond movie is about fresh water. Okay? And that's what the Quantum of Solace was. And the evil mastermind here had bought up and was storing fresh water in a South American country. And the people in the land, of course, were suffering from drought and not being able to grow crops, while this evil mastermind was controlling the fresh water and was going to basically take over the country. Well, of course, in all James Bond movies, James gets the girl, and he saves the day, he kills the bad guy, and now this country has got its fresh water back. But for me, a really surprising story that Hollywood even recognized that water actually is important. I thought there was another one there. Okay. Here's another story about water, a long way from us now, but the Aral Sea used to be the 5th largest freshwater body on the planet. Back in the 1980s, the Soviet Union decided that they were going to try and grow cotton in this particular area. And so they diverted water from the major rivers and streams that flowed into the Aral Sea to irrigate for cotton. Okay. Interestingly, before they did this, they talked to their Soviet Academy of Sciences. And the Soviet Academy of Sciences assured the government there would be no negative environmental effects of doing this. Of course, it was the Soviet Union, so they probably weren't allowed to report that there would be effects. And this is something like, over on the right-hand side, what the Aral Sea looks like today. So it basically has ceased to exist almost. So around the Aral Sea used to be many towns with thousands of people living, a healthy fishing industry, and today, nothing happens. Sorry? Towards the back. Can we have the next slide? Can we just rotate them? Technology. So one of the results of this drying, obviously you can see, is that the sea has disappeared and it's no longer the 5th largest freshwater system on the planet. But you can probably make out that this is effectively turned into desert now. And so the whole area has become dry. What's left of the water has become saline, and so it's no longer a freshwater system. People in this area, many I think now probably have moved, but they had a significant increase in the amount of cancer and other health issues because of the sand and dirt that now dominated this environment, and because of the extremely high salinity. And so even now they're talking about trying to do something about recover this system. But you can see that's, we're 20 or 30 years down the track. Here's a photo of part of the aerial sea now. Fishing boats and that sort of thing, high and dry, and obviously left where they were. And the sea, because of its large size, did have a large number of species, fish and those sort of things, and of course they're pretty much gone now. Even the US intelligence agencies have realized that water is becoming a critical resource. And this was a report that was produced a few years ago by joint US agencies, which indicated that they saw fresh water as becoming a major conflict, a reason for conflict over the next century or so. So, where does that leave us? Well, fresh waters, our rivers and lakes and streams, support about 10% of all species on the planet, including nearly a third of all the vertebrate species depend on fresh water. Back from 1970 to 2000, world freshwater species declined by about 55%, so actually went extinct. The IUCN Red List indicated that 30% of the world's freshwater fish species were now threatened or endangered. And there's been a lot of work done in the US, and they've shown that they're losing species at about 4% per decade. What about us? What about New Zealand, Aotearoa? Well, we're fine, of course. We're 100% pure. But, in fact, we know that there has been significant degradation of a number of our freshwater systems. One example are wetlands, swamps, and those sort of systems. Historically, New Zealand had a lot of swampland, a lot of wetlands, about 2.4 million hectares. But in 1980, it was estimated that about 90% of our wetlands were gone. They'd been drained and cleared, used for irrigation, for urbanisation, etc. In the North Island, there's only about 5% of our wetlands left, and in Canterbury, even closer to home, we've lost nearly 93% of the wetlands. And in fact, a number of years ago, the mayors of certainly central Canterbury agreed on a strategy which involved creating new wetlands. Here's an example. This is an aerial photograph from Southland, and you can see here quite an extensive wetland on the left-hand side, bottom left-hand side of the photograph. But on the right-hand side, this wetland has been fenced and drained and being converted to agriculture. That's all about water quantity. What about water quality? What about the quality of the water? Unfortunately, still some bad news here. So our National Water Quality Monitoring Network, so we have a national network of around about 100 river systems, which is monitored regularly by NIWA, has shown in the last 20 years that there's significant declines in the quality of our fresh water in our streams and lakes and rivers and that sort of thing. 2004, 96% of the 300 lowland waterways failed human recreational contact standards. So that's due to things like E. coli, fecal bacteria, sediment, and those sort of things. 43% of the lakes that have been monitored also had poor water quality. And the numbers are a bit vague on this, but something like 18 to 34,000 New Zealanders get sick every year because of waterborne disease. And probably for many of us might remember Havelock North, which wasn't that long ago, where over 4,000 people became sick because of Campylobacter leaching out of a sewage system. Back in about 2009, Cawthron Institute produced a report where they had compared over 300 rivers worldwide and looked at their water quality. They used a particular metric that's not sort of well understood. It was to do with the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water and the production of algae. And their report found that of the 300 rivers in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and then Oceania, the Manawatu was the worst river on the planet. The local authorities, of course, didn't really appreciate this getting into the news, And I think this Tom Scott cartoon's quite a good representation of that, because the sources of contaminants into the Manawatu River were things like the Palmerston North sewage scheme and the sewage schemes of a number of the smaller towns in the area, industrial waste being discharged into the Manawatu, and intensive agricultural activities. Horizons Regional Council are still struggling with this, how to improve the Manawatu. There have been, I think, major gains as far as the sewage systems are concerned, but there's still issues in the system. Again, a lot closer to home for us. This is Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora, just effectively down the road from us. And in this article, an Environment Court judge declared that the Lake Ellesmere was technically dead. Technically, well, and it's not dead, there is still life in it, but certainly it's highly degraded. The lake for many years has been what we call hypereutrophic, so very high levels of nutrients. As you can probably tell, there was a lot of sediment in this system, and a lot of the freshwater communities that lived in these systems crashed. This used to be a major trout fishery. Back in the 1930s, there would be trout spawning, running up the rivers like the Selwyn River and that sort of thing. And Fish and Game used to do counts of this. And at one stage, they had about 85,000 fish going up the Selwyn River to spawn. In the 1970s, that was 26 fish from 85,000. Today, Lake Ellesmere is still hypereutrophic. It still looks like this. I've done quite a bit of work out there, and I've got to tell you, it's quite depressing. So you go into the lake and you put your hand down in the water, and you can't see your hand after it goes down about 10 centimetres. It's so turbid, okay? And there's been various efforts to try and improve this water quality, but a lot of the issues are actually not here, they're upcountry. They're in the streams and rivers and the land surrounding them, in which high nutrients and sediment and those sort of things are flowing downhill into the lake. The lake is effectively the bottom of the drain, right? So I want to talk a little bit about ecology, about when we talk about how healthy are streams and rivers and lakes, we're not just necessarily using water quality. We often use the biological community in these systems as indicators of how well they're doing, of how healthy or unhealthy they are. And at the bottom of this little cartoon here is the food resources, which keep everything going. So algae, the slimy stuff we see in streams and rivers, bacteria and fungi, which are decomposing wood and leaves that fall into our streams and rivers. So wood and leaves are actually important to have in rivers, something that the City Council might like to know about. And we do have larger plants. We have moss and those sort of things. But actually those larger plants, the weeds you see growing, are not actually used much by the organisms that are in the stream or river or lake. Certainly some of the birds feed off them. But in the middle of this diagram here are stream invertebrates. These are small insects, small animals, worms and snails and those sort of things. And they are a critical part of this entire system because they basically eat the algae, bacteria and organic matter, and they are the food for most of our fish and crayfish and larger organisms. All of the New Zealand native species of fish are predatory. They feed on other small fish or they feed on invertebrates and insects. So this whole food web sort of hangs together by these players playing their part in this system. I'll talk briefly about birds. I don't know anything about birds, but you know they're in the cartoon, so I've got to talk a little bit about birds, right? So here's a bunch of freshwater, wetland type birds. Over on the left-hand side, anyone know what this bird is? It's the ribble, yeah. Really cool animal because, I don't know how well you can see, but its beak is actually bent, okay? And it feeds on these stream invertebrates, these aquatic invertebrates. They're hiding underneath stones and boulders, and so the bird sort of sticks its beak round and picks up these insects. So a real specialist that's feeding on stream invertebrates. This is a blue duck, Theo, which is now pretty much limited to mountain streams around the country. White heron, probably many of you have seen. And over here, the thing that we probably see all the time and would rather not see. A lot of our birds use wetlands. 3 of them here, nationally critical, black stork, grey duck, and the white heron, and a number of are endangered and vulnerable. We actually don't really know how many freshwater birds have gone extinct because of the changes which have occurred. Let's talk about fish. Okay, so they're major players in the system. Over here on the left, whitebait. Okay, this thing down here is a mudfish. This is a Canterbury mudfish. So it's a mudfish species that's only found in Canterbury. It's one of the rarest native fish in New Zealand. So it's also on the threatened list. And eels, of course. We've got a couple of species of eels. And then over here, some exotics. This is a pretty big brown trout and a koi carp over there. So a reasonable percentage of our freshwater fish are actually introduced. They're exotic fish. And there's a whole story related to that as well. But let's talk about whitebait for a little while. So whitebait, of course, major recreational fishing for many people. We got any whitebaiters in the audience? One or 2 people, yeah, sort of. This guy's going to bag whitebaiting, so I better not put my hand up. Yeah, so a lot of people are whitebaiting. We know that some people probably even store their whitebait and sell them to make a little bit of profit in winter. But actually, whitebait are an issue. They consist of up to 5 species of galaxids. So the family galaxids are the most speciose family in New Zealand. And in any whitebait catch, you can catch up to 5 different species. More often than not, what you're catching is the inanga, which is sort of the silvery type one. But there's also 4 other species there. There's banded kokapoo, koaro, short jaw kokapoo, and giant kokapoo. And these 4 grow to quite larger fish. The giant kokapoo, the one on the bottom right-hand side there, can actually grow to about 1/2 metre long. So they're actually quite decent-sized fish. What you might notice here is that I've put an asterisk next to 4 of these species, inanga, koaro, short jaw, and giant kokapoo, because these 4 species are on the threatened species list. All right? So they're actually endangered. And yet we are recreationally fishing whitebait. Now the whitebait season has been set to try and reduce the number of some of these other species, in particular giant kokapoo being caught. The giant kokapoo juveniles tend to come into our rivers a little bit later on in the season. So most of what people catch is probably inanga. But as the season goes on, more and more of these other species will appear in the whitebait. When you're looking at a whitebait in a bucket, it's very difficult to tell the difference between these species, okay? It's not until they become adults that really it's more obvious that, oh, hold on, wait a minute, I've got a completely different fish here. So what's happening with our native fish? Well, they're becoming increasingly threatened. So from the 1990s, about 20% of our native freshwater fish were threatened. And you can see it's increased steadily over the decades. It stops at 2010 there, where it was over 60%. Now it's about 74% of our native freshwater fish species are now threatened. One of the other fish that some of you may have seen a bit of, perhaps, are eels. There's basically 3 species of eels in New Zealand. Just going to talk about one of them called long-finned eel. In 2013, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment released a study of the population trends of long-finned eels. Now, long-finned eels are commercially harvested. They're caught live and set overseas. And of course, iwi use eels as part of the mahinga kai, and I'm sure some other people do as well. The thing about these eels is that they go to the sea to complete part of their life cycle, and they travel across the Pacific Ocean quite vast distances. So the eel fishery, the catch rate, goes up and down from year to year. And you can see from 1965 to 1970 it went up. That's because they basically started catching eels. And then right across to 1995, the catch rate varied markedly from year to year. However, from about 1995, the trend has only been in one direction, and that's down. So the catches are reducing. And in fact, we see that, the scientific community sees that when they go out and sample and catch these animals, less and less long-finned eels are being caught. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment was saying, we need to do something about this. That was only 10 years ago. Interestingly, about the same time, a research group in the North Island, led by Brenda Bailey, did a pretty cool experiment which might provide some insight into part of the problems that long-finned eels are happening. She did this experiment with a team of helpers where they removed wood from a number of streams and rivers. And by wood, I'm talking about big logs and those sort of things, which would normally occur in a natural stream with a forest and that sort of thing. So she basically removed the wood out of a bunch of these streams and had another group of streams where she didn't touch, left the wood in there. And then they sampled for long-finned eels, and they found, in fact, that where wood had been removed, there were no juvenile long-finned eels at all. Whereas in the streams which had wood, they had quite reasonable densities, abundances of juvenile long-finned eels. So this was quite an important finding, that actually in our mountain streams and those streams that are still in reasonable condition, actually having wood in them provides habitat for some of these fish, actually essential habitat. A lot of our native fish are migratory. They have to go to the sea to complete part of their life cycle. Okay? And so that means when we put barriers in our streams and rivers and lakes, there's a reasonable chance that those are going to be barriers to the movement of these fish that have to go to the sea and come back again. A simple example are these culverts. This was actually mainly in a forestry block, where up the top there, the top two, are culverts which have an overhang and a waterfall. And so this is very, very difficult for native fish, and in fact even many introduced fish, to get up this culvert, through it, and further to the stream upstream. And so increasingly, a number of the councils and other agencies are now trying to make sure that when they produce culverts, they are actually down at water level, so it's not a barrier to fish. If you think about other barriers, hydro dams and those sort of things, they are significant barriers to a lot of our freshwater fish species. So, what's the scoreboard look like? 74% of our native fish species threatened at the present moment. We only know of one that's gone extinct. That was the New Zealand grayling, and that went extinct in the 1930s, 1940s. Apparently there were millions of grayling. They were like American salmon coming up major river systems. And then in the 1940s they disappeared. No one really knows why. A lot of our species are endemic, so they're only found in New Zealand. These galaxids I've talked about, which dominate our species, and many of them are threatened. The Canterbury mudfish has some cousins. It has 4 other species of mudfish here in New Zealand, and all of them are threatened or at risk. So, happy days. One of the other players are the stream invertebrates, those small insects and small animals that are essential part of the food web. Here's a piece of wood that I just picked up in a stream on the west coast, and I don't know how well you can see it, but all those little black-grey things are invertebrates, are insects. In fact, they're actually all stoneflies. And the little yellow one down towards the bottom of the piece of wood is a stonefly that's just shed its skin. It's just molted relatively recently, and so it's got this sort of yellow colour. Its exoskeleton, its skin will harden up and it'll become grey in a few hours or so. But you can see here that if you go to a healthy stream system and pick up a piece of wood, pick up a boulder, and look underneath it, you'll probably find lots and lots of these small animals, these small invertebrates. And in fact, we have many species here in New Zealand. We have, at the moment, roughly 660 different species of stream invertebrates. The top left-hand side there is a mayfly, which any of you who are anglers will know about mayflies. Trout like eating mayflies. They're quite sensitive to pollution, okay? In the middle, top right there, is a stonefly, and on the right-hand side is a whole lot of caddisflies in their cases on a piece of wood. So all these caddisflies are all grouped together. There's actually insects inside those cases. Bottom left, freshwater mussel, a kakahi. So scientifically, there's more interest being taken in the freshwater mussel recently because they're possibly in trouble. And in the middle bottom there, kura, a freshwater crayfish. So we have 3 species of freshwater crayfish in this country. And there are a couple of companies that actually aquaculture, farm crayfish, and they call them sweet crayfish. They're actually supposed to taste quite nice. I've never tried one. So, 660 species, 95% of them, actually it's probably more than that, it's probably more like about 97%, are endemic, are only found in New Zealand, the only place on the planet. In fact, that animal that's making up most of that photo here, that large, bizarre-looking thing, is actually a fly larvae. And that fly larvae is only, that particular species is only found in Banks Peninsula. You won't find it anywhere else in the world. It's actually a pretty cool-looking animal. You wouldn't think it's a maggot, would you? Right? You think about fly larvae as maggots. Well, I wouldn't call that a maggot. Of our known species, 88 are threatened, 48 nationally critical. So that's the same status as the kiwi, right? So they're in trouble. Unfortunately, there's about 180 which are what we call data deficient. We actually just don't know enough about them. So nearly a third of our species, we don't know enough about what condition they're in. So what's causing all this degradation? Well, a whole bunch of things, and I could talk probably for way too long about all the things that are causing it. But if I was to pick one thing, I would say intensification of land use is probably a major issue. And that's resulted in significant contaminants into our waterways, loss of habitat, so where these animals and fish actually live, extraction of water for irrigation and other purposes, and not the best management of our waterways is also a significant issue. So let's talk about just a few of these sort of contaminants. And the first one I want to talk about briefly is sediment, fine sediment. For a long time, people scientists I'm talking about, didn't really think about sediment being a major issue. I mean, we have braided rivers, they're full of sediment, right? But also a lot of the smaller streams and rivers usually have boulders and cobbles and large stones, okay? And we're seeing increasingly that a number of those systems, particularly in agricultural systems, are now covered in fine soil and sand and mud and sediment. So excessive fine sediment can be a real issue. How is it an issue? Well, most normal natural streams and rivers have big boulders, big stones and cobbles and that sort of thing. And between the boulders and cobbles, there's gaps, okay? What we call interstitial spaces. And water can percolate through the bed of the stream. And small invertebrates will actually burrow down into it. And some of our fish will actually also burrow down into these gaps between the boulders and cobbles. So if you have a major flood event, everyone dives for cover. Get down underneath the boulders. Hope the flood isn't so big it starts moving the substrate on you. That's a little bit dodgy. And you might survive this experience. Well, what happens when you have high sediment deposition occurring, of course, is that this becomes clogged up. The system becomes sedimented. All these fine spaces, interstitial spaces and gaps between the substrate become full of sediment. And now water can't percolate up from the bottom of the bed. Spring systems can't percolate up. Our invertebrates have got nowhere to hide. So fish and other predators can capture them easily. When there's a flood event, the invertebrates get washed away, as do the fish, so the fish can't hide. And so you can see that this fine sediment has the potential to have a lot of effects on the animals that live in these streams and river systems. We've got more than a few invasive species in this country. I'm not going to talk about too many of them. One is Didymo. There hasn't been much talk about Didymo in recent times, but it's still here, believe it or not. Over on the left-hand side is a photograph of some Didymo in this lake outlet, and you can see it's just a mass of goopy, ugly algae. It's actually a single-celled algae, believe it or not, which forms these enormous mats. And Didymo has had an enormous effect on the other species that live in these streams and rivers. So a lot of those small invertebrates can't eat Didymo. Okay? And now the bed of their waterway is covered in this stuff. So we see a major decline in some of those species that we might expect to see as representing a healthy stream. Fish are also affected. So we did this study which had a look at what happens to brown trout in stream and river systems that had Didymo in it. So if you just have a look at that graph on the bottom right-hand side there, the bottom axis is actually the amount of Didymo, the biomass, quantity of Didymo that's in the stream. So it's low on the left, going higher and higher towards the right. The other axis is the biomass, the quantity of trout that are in the system with these different things. And you can see here that the amount of trout biomass declines, goes down, as the Didymo biomass increases. So we've got a significant effect here of Didymo on trout. And that's not surprising because trout feed on those stream invertebrates, which now have been excluded because Didymo's taken over. Well, one of the other contaminants that's in a lot of the news is nitrate. And so there's been an increasing look at, well, how important is nitrate in these systems? This is a sort of a map which shows possible likelihood. I love this. This was done by government, so of course they're not going to tell you really what's going on. They're going to gloss over it a little bit. And the red here is bad, okay, very bad levels of nitrate. And you can see, unfortunately, Canterbury's got quite a few red dots in it. And a very high percentage of New Zealand rivers that were monitored regularly have high nitrate nitrogen. So what? Why are we concerned about nitrate nitrogen? Firstly, nitrogen, fertilizer, and a number of those nutrients encourage plant growth. And so we start to get things like toxic algal blooms occurring where high nutrients occur. There's other things as well, there's warm temperatures and sunshine, but nitrate's certainly part of the story. So increase in nitrogen and toxic algal blooms and a type of algae that we see in things like the Otakokino River, which is this black slime. That's another toxic algae which is growing in a number of these systems. From a human health point of view, there's increasing concern about how this affects us. So nitrate, if you're drinking nitrate, you know, cups of tea and drinking water and milk and all that sort of thing, in a catchment that has high nitrate, you're getting nitrate in your body, okay? Nitrate preferentially binds to red blood cells instead of oxygen, okay? So we need oxygen, right, to survive, and our blood system is circulating oxygen around our body. If we have very high levels of nitrate in the water that we're consuming, then our blood has the potential to be not taking up oxygen as it needs to, but actually taking up and binding with nitrogen. This is seen most strongly in young infants, and we have this thing called blue baby syndrome. So you can see the extremities of this baby here, its fingers, ears, lips, etc., have turned blue, and this is effectively nitrate binding preferentially to its blood cells, so it's not getting enough oxygen. Okay. There are other things as well. There's been a study recently which has shown that high nitrate is linked to colon cancer and various other things. But then, I guess, you know, we know that tomorrow there's going to be yet another study that's going to show that something else causes cancer, so join the club. But high nitrate is an issue. There's a bunch of other contaminants. I'm not going to deal with all of them. I'll show you a couple of them. This one on the left-hand side, this is a photograph taken from a coal mine stream. So a lot of coal mining on the west coast, and a lot of coal is often associated with various heavy metals: iron, aluminium, zinc, nickel, arsenic. A whole cocktail of metals can be bound to the coal. So when they dig the coal up, they expose the coal obviously to oxygen and to rainwater, and you have this, actually it's acidic water is produced, and various metals leach out of the system. And on the bottom of that photograph there, you can see this sort of orangey brown, which looks a bit like rust. Well, it sort of is rust. That's hydrogen iron hydroxide. So it's iron that's actually precipitated out of the water and is leached onto the substrate. One of the other contaminants, which is relatively, or been recognised relatively recently, are these things called forever chemicals. And that's on the right-hand side here, so PAFS. That's the chemical name for it. But they're called forever chemicals. Why are they called forever chemicals? Because they last forever. These are synthetic chemicals that we've made, and they're used in a whole range of products, from packaging for fast food goods, detergents, photography, what else has got there? Non-stick frying pans have forever chemicals in them. So once they've been made, they last forever. And this has become a concern because there's been an increasing amount of work done overseas which actually shows that these things bioaccumulate. They don't break down. So if a fish has got some forever chemicals in it and you have fish and chips for dinner, then you're going to bioaccumulate these forever chemicals in your body. One study recently indicated that rainwater around much of the planet had forever chemicals in it. Okay. So, very grim situation. The US have EPA have a toxicity value for various chemicals, and they have been making the forever chemicals toxicity value more and more tighter over the years. They're really realizing that, in fact, these things could have very toxic effects on people. The good news is, about 2 weeks ago, a research group in America developed a way of breaking down forever chemicals. So that's been a major breakthrough, which I imagine is going to be spread around the world. So there is now some light at the end of the tunnel that these forever chemicals might actually be able to be dealt with. But they're in the system, they're in the environment. We probably have some in our bodies right now. Of course, we've done a whole bunch of other things to our planet as well. We've turned night to day. And I'm sure many of you have seen these satellite photographs where cities around the world are almost like daylight. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Las Vegas, but there's no such thing as daylight, as a night in Las Vegas. It goes 24/7. That actually affects a whole bunch of animals. Not surprisingly, probably, once you think about it. Here's a photograph I took on the left-hand side of a window outside a McDonald's. And all these animals on the window here are mayflies. So these mayflies have all been attracted to the blue wavelength of the artificial light in this McDonald's. On the right-hand side, a car which is covered, again, this happens to be mayflies. And again, they're attracted to the refraction and reflection of light of certain types of cars of different colors and different types of windows. So all these mayflies, they're supposed to be having babies, right? These adults are supposed to come out, mate, and the female lays her eggs back in the stream or river or lake. All of these animals that go and sit outside a McDonald's waiting for a Big Mac, they're not going to help the species survive in its natural environment in streams and rivers and that sort of thing. So a significant issue there. Urban areas have a lot of contaminants. And again, I'm not going to go through all these, but I don't know how well you can see them, but there's things like cigarettes, there's oil, hydrocarbons, wear and tear on tires, microplastics is another big one that we're hearing more and more about now. So urban systems, urban streams and rivers and lakes often tend to be the most heavily degraded. They're the most polluted because they're having all of these contaminants flow into them during storm water, rainfall events and those sort of things. So a couple of years ago, I did a study of the Avon River here. So this is the Avon River. It's my interpretation of the Avon River. It's something like that. My pointer's not really working now, but I'll come over here to give you an idea. This is Hagley Park here, and that's the square over there, and we're way over there. Okay, so this is the length of the Avon River with a whole bunch of its tributaries. 40 years ago, a guy by the name of Jim Robb, who was working for the Catchment Board, did this massive survey of streams and rivers in Christchurch, the Avon, Heathcote, etc. And they had teams that went out and collected these small invertebrates at a whole bunch of sites along these systems. Really important information as far as us understanding how things had changed. 40 years later, I went out and sampled some of his systems. I didn't sample all of them. There were way too many samples they looked at. And what did I find? Well, not surprisingly, there's been some pretty massive changes. So the orange on the left-hand side, which is sort of out towards we are here in Avonhead, were smaller streams and spring systems. Most of those today are dry, or they only flow during rainfall events. Okay. Way back 40 years ago, they were flowing streams, spring-fed systems. And in the orange, they had this particularly ugly-looking animal on the left-hand side, top left-hand side there. That's the larvae of a beetle, a particular beetle. It's called a riffle beetle. That's its common name. Riffle being like a rapid, fast water. That's where they like to live. So they don't like to live in a dry stream bed with no water. So all of those aquatic beetles are gone. They're extinct in Christchurch. On the bottom left-hand side is a mayfly, one of those ones I mentioned briefly before, very sensitive to pollution and that sort of thing. Mayflies used to be all along the green bit. So from further up the Avon River, probably towards the university almost, well, in fact, they were in the university streams, right down through Hagley Park, right through the centre of the city. We used to have mayflies 40 years ago. Gone, completely disappeared. Not surprising, considering the amount of contaminants flowing into these systems. And on the bottom right, freshwater crayfish, kura, again, were found at a number of sites throughout Christchurch City. They're not anymore. There's possibly a few at the groins, but certainly not in the Avon and Heathcote. So I've presented, I think, a pretty depressing story, right? It doesn't sound very good. But actually, I think there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think there is a future for us. Here's an example of one stream restoration project that I was involved in. This was part of the Carrick's program, a waterway experiment, and also part of Living Water. So we had Department of Conservation and Fonterra help funded this system. So this is a little spring-fed system out towards Springfield, out past Lincoln, and the landowners there were really concerned about what's happened to their stream, their spring-fed system. They felt it was degraded and contaminated, and they wanted to do something about it. As it just so happens, this stream flows all the way down to Selwyn River, and the councils are quite concerned about the water quality in the Selwyn River. So this was sort of quite appropriate. So we came along and did a whole bunch of stuff. We mainly did scientific, geeky, experimental stuff in these systems, but we did do some practical things as well. So I'm going to show you a sequence of photos, and that, I think it's a poplar tree on the top left here, is in most of the photos to give you an idea of where we're looking. So this is what it looked like when we started. There's a big hawthorn hedge on the right. On the left, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's this massive bank. It was over 2 meters high. And this was all soil and mud, which they dug out of the stream to clean it, make it nice and clean. And they'd done this over decades. So this was a massive bank of soil. And if you go on the stream side of it, that was all collapsing. So there was sediment falling into the stream every time there was a rainfall event. So it wasn't in very good condition. It also happened to have a major problem with the weeds. So believe it or not, there actually is a waterway in there. Okay, well, what do? We decided we needed to do something about this. So one of the things we did was got in and removed that hawthorn hedge from the right-hand side. And then we got rid of that big bank on the left-hand side and turned the stream into this. So there's that poplar on the top left again to give you a context. And so what we've done here is rebattered the stream. We moved the banks back so they were gently sloping. The point being here now that there weren't any undercut banks that could fall into the stream. Every time it rained, there wouldn't be sediment pouring into the stream, assuming we did something like plant on on this soil that was exposed. And of course, that's exactly what we did do. So we planted on both sides of the stream. The farmer paid for new fences, again on both sides. And this is the stream about 4 or 5 years ago. So you can see it's starting to look pretty nice. In fact, I did take a photo relatively recently, which I couldn't find for this talk, but the stream now is virtually covered over. The vegetation is covered over and providing shading and that sort of thing for the animals that are in the stream system. We know that the fish numbers have just gone through the roof with this rebattering and planting and shading. So a win in that regard. There's been some other sort of pretty interesting things happen in recent times. And many of you may be aware of this ruling that the Wanganui River has been ruled to be a person. So it now has the rights of a human being. That's a world first, by the way. So they're talking about this in North America and Europe, that New Zealand has actually got a river that has the legal rights of a human being. So that means that people can't come along and pollute the Wanganui River now. Or they might be able to, but they'll be in trouble if they do. And so the Wanganui effectively has got some level of conservation along the length of it. I know that iwi are considering other rivers that they might also try and make a move towards giving legal status. One of the other things that's happened in relatively recent times is this thing called a National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management. And basically this is a government regulation which has laid down a whole lot of water quality guidelines that regional councils have to adhere to. So it's a few years old now. A lot of the councils are definitely dragging their feet on this, but it has possibilities. So what does the future hold? I think, we're at a pathway here, and we have been at this pathway for a while. We can either carry on business as usual, contaminating our waters, extracting water for irrigation and all those sort of things, or we can think about, well, what are we going to do to try and reduce the degradation of our waterways and retain the very rich biodiversity that New Zealand has with all these endemic species. Okay, so on that I'll take any questions. I think this gentleman has a...
I'm going to be rude and ask 2 questions. The first thing is, when did we last see a blue baby? Because I don't think they're very common, and the amount of nitrogen we've got in our water seems to be blamed for a lot that I would question. The other is that we must have hundreds of thousands of these lovely geese in our streams. We're blaming the poor sheep, and I suspect the geese might be a major component. They certainly are in Ellesmere, and if you look down the Avon, I don't know how many, I counted 100 in one paddock one morning.
So I don't know the answer to your first question. You're right, I don't think blue baby syndrome is very common at all. In fact, the levels of nitrate that are in the water that might cause blue baby syndrome are in some areas in Canterbury, but not spread all around Canterbury. So the concentration of nitrate's not high enough. I guess the government has used blue baby syndrome as one example. Okay, the colon cancer is another study that's come out from overseas. I think the thing is we know that the levels of nitrate in some of these waterways are extremely high. And that's going to cause problems long term if we do nothing about it. Canada geese, I agree with you 1,000%. I think they're a major problem. And unfortunately, as I understand it, Fish and Game some years ago took Canada geese off the hunting list. And the idea was that was going to then mean that people could go and kill Canada geese anytime. And of course, what's happening is they're not. Right? And I've certainly been in streams and spring systems where there's just Canada geese poop everywhere. So they are certainly a source of nitrate.
Yvonne Loader. Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. That was fantastic. My question relates to Lake Dunstan, a man-made lake in central Otago. In a very short period after that was flooded and established, there was a weed came down from the north end of the lake, and over the next years, it just crept down the lake. What caused that, and what effect did it have on the quality of the water? I see you were shaking your head.
Yeah, so Lake Dunstan, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's down by Cromwell, and it's got a massive infestation of lagrosiphon. So that's the name of this aquatic weed. Lagrosiphon has been spread to a number of lakes around the country, mainly by people. Not deliberately, but accidentally, having a fragment of lagrosiphon around the propeller of their boat or something like that. So it's an exotic plant, it's not a New Zealand plant. It spreads very quickly from a small fragment. So it now has, taken over almost the top of the lake and is moving down the lake itself. It has had an effect on the fishery significantly. Interestingly, some native fish like bullies have done well because they're now able to hide from other bigger fish and they don't get preyed on. The bigger fish, trout, those sort of things, are not doing so well at all because they can't easily now catch small fish and that sort of thing. So those sort of weeds, aquatic weeds, are actually quite common around the country, and often they are a major nuisance, and they often do change the community. Lagrosiphon doesn't actually really affect the water quality. It affects the habitat and that sort of thing. Oh, another person with two questions.
Paul Marsh,
Oh.
not talking.
Sorry, Paul.
Sorry, carrying on from what you said, what is you talk about boats and things like that transferring these problems. What's the effect of bird life? Because they're flying from one lake to the other or up the streams.
Mm-hmm. So there's a faint possibility that birds are spreading them. So a number of the birds will eat these weeds, but they then get into the digestive system of the bird and they are usually broken down quite significantly. And when they're pooped out, it's relatively unlikely that they're going to germinate a new plant from it. So there are examples of birds spreading some of these pests, but in the case of weeds, most of them really probably are being spread by us. Paul.
Quickly, Paul Marsh, how pure is our artesian water?
It used to be really pure. There's no one answer to that. Some of the artesian water in Christchurch is actually subterranean water that leaks out of the Waimakariri River. So as the Waimakariri comes down from the plains, it sort of does a left turn to go out to sea. And some of that water is leached down into the groundwater and comes through across Christchurch City. And so some of our artesian water actually gets Waimak River. And that's still pretty good. The Waimak River is still pretty good quality. Also, leaching through those silts and gravels can clean it a little bit. As you move further south, less of the Waimak water is occurring, and we're depending on water that's coming across the Canterbury Plains. There are some areas moving south, and if you go as far as Ashburton, then they have, put it this way, if I was living in Ashburton, I would be concerned about drinking the water.
Thank you very much indeed for the information. I'm interested in the way in which the mayflies were attracted to McDonald's and the influence of the blue light. And I would like to know what the scientific community is doing to engage constructively with Wāhi Kotahi, the Transport Authority, to stop putting 4,000 Kelvin LEDs all over the cities and destroying putting so much blue light that if they're not careful, the entire country will be on sleeping pills.
In fact, there was a presentation earlier this week on the effect of LED lights on these small insects and invertebrates. And so a student of mine was involved in doing this research, and it showed quite clearly that the lower heat lamps were preferable over, well, they were talking about 6,500 kelvins, 5,600 kelvins. LED lights that are down towards 3,500 or 4,000 certainly will attract a lot less insects. So actually, this is a worldwide thing at the present moment, and it's one of the reasons why a number of councils are moving to LED lights, because it's got reduced environmental effect. The other thing about LED lights is they can control them. I mean, they've even talked about, potentially dimming them or turning them off at certain times. So if you had a massive emergence of insects, you might actually tell people, hey, there's going to be a lot of moths and flies around the place tonight. We're actually going to dim the street lights a little bit.
They did it 10 years ago in Paris.
Really? Cool.
I think we need to stop this at some stage. You obviously could go on for another half hour or so. Everybody's very enthused. It's my job to thank you, John, for your presentation today. Everybody's been very taken with it, I think. I found most of it pretty depressing, actually, so that I was hoping for more positive stuff towards the end.
The next couple of weeks, you're going to have positive.
2 or 3 minutes. But thank you very much for a very detailed, informative address, and would you all show your appreciation in the usual way? Thank you.
Thank you.
I should tell you too that John isn't taking a fee, he's giving it as a kohar to City Mission.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you. Cheers.